Thanks, everyone. My name is Aaron. I'm from Mesa Conversations, along with Jean, Aaron, and Janet. And at first, just want to thank the Masons for having us here. And I want to introduce our panel. This is going to be a great event. It's on historic preservation in La Mesa, myths, realities, and benefits. We have Jim Newland, who's the president of the Historical Society. We have Allyson, Kinnard, who's a senior planner with the city. Nikki Kreibich, who's a historical property appraisal expert. And Stephen Castro, who owns a historic property, right? I'm guessing? Perfect. All right, let's go.
Yes, and restrooms in the back and all that kind of good stuff back on the side there. Great. Well, thanks everyone. Well, glad you came out and decided to spend a couple little hours with us here. I'm going to start this off with hopefully about a 40-minute, no more than that, presentation. So I'm going to throw a lot of stuff at you. I used to joke that this is about 6 or 7 presentations that used to be full-on trainings down into about 5 minutes each to get you sort of background on what's going on in historic preservation overall, as well as how it affects La Mesa and what we're doing. So yes, I'm the president of the Mesa Historical Society, but also I've been practicing in the cultural resource management field for around 30 years now. I work for California State Parks Department and oversee a lot of the large preservation projects and planning projects that affect that, and involved in that for about 24 years with state parks. Previous to that, I worked for the Forest Service, as well as a historical resources consultant, historian, archaeologist, and interpreter. So I've done quite a bit of work in this business, and a few years back, the La Mesa Historical Society found out I was here, and that sort of sucked me into a few little projects. I ended up writing a history of La Mesa for our centennial. Also then wrote the Mount Helix Park Foundation grabbed me, and then I ended up writing a book on the history of the Grossmont Mount Helix area, and then most recently my last book was on around here was on the Grossmont Hospital district and the history of that for their so I've done quite a bit of that, and in between all of that I got sort of roped into some fun things. I've been on the city's planning commission for I guess about 6 years now, which then ended up putting me ex officio member of also the Historic Preservation Commission due to my expertise helping out on that. And so what we're going to talk a little bit about here is how the program works in La Mesa, how it works, what is a historic property, what isn't, what are some of the myths about what that means if your property is either a listed property or even on just the inventory, or if it's just old, what's that mean? So we'll talk a little bit about that, some of that, and we'll, once we go through that, you'll also be able to ask our panelists on how the process works here in the city. What's it mean for your property values, and how's that worked out, and how that fits into some of the benefits like the Mills Act tax break that comes for historic properties. And then we'll talk to Stephen, who actually must live within one of these places. What does that mean when you have a listed property? How does that affect your life? Is it great? What's real and what's mythology about living with a historic property? So I want to thank first, of course, La Mesa Conversations. This is part of a bigger public outreach program, because one of the things we're trying to help the city with is update our historical survey, which I'll talk about a little later, was very cutting edge when it was completed in 1984. And it hasn't really been updated. And so we're a little behind on the update, but we'll talk about what we're doing to help with all kinds of partners and volunteers to help catch that up. So there's enough background, I think, on that, and now we're going to dive right into it. So today we're going to get into some really exciting topics that are going to take us, if you can catch the metaphor, down the rabbit hole. We're going to go, and as you can see, poor Alice is being swamped by all the acronyms and the planning and the CEQAs and all the other environmental rules that come with this, because people are always concerned, what does this all mean? What's all this regulation, et cetera, et cetera? And so we're going to talk a little bit about that. So I'm going to try to cover quickly, and I am going to go quickly, so I appreciate that. Will be plenty of time for questions of any of us on things like what are the laws, what are the realities of this, what actually makes a property historical property. There's a lot more than age. What are some of the myths of historic preservation that you can or can't do with your property if it happens to be historic, and then talk a little bit about the benefits, the actual greenness that historic preservation inherently keeps in its process, a little bit about property evaluations and things like the Mills Act tax benefit, which is probably the #1 fiscal benefit of a historic property, and then as I talk to folks who actually, Stephen and others who actually live with a historic property and how that works. So as I mentioned to you, my background, I've been doing this for quite a while. It's both a profession and a passion. I've always had an interest in history. My master's degree is in public history, which is the applied history field. So trained not only to be a historian and do all of the scholarship and that side of it, but also then apply that into land use planning, property management in the case of agencies such as state parks, who I work for, which is the largest, of course, land owning agency in the state system that has properties. And our mission is actually the only mission in the state system to preserve historic and natural resources as well as provide recreation. There's lots of agencies that have historians who deal with them. It's like Caltrans actually is the #1 employer of historians in the state service right now. That's to move things out of way of freeways, unfortunately, not to preserve them, but to meet all the laws that come with all this, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And so we're going to focus first on the realities and sort of give you some more details on these topics, and then a little bit on the myths that sometimes come with this subject matter. But first, I'll give you a really brief sort of interlude of how historic preservation got in the United States, because historic preservation is done similarly, but not the same in all areas of the world. In fact, I always love to tell the story of when we happened to do a trip to Greece. My daughter was about 10 years old. We're at the Acropolis Museum, and she starts rattling off the names of the gods up on this frieze that was in this exhibit, and the docent comes over, and he could speak English, the multiple languages, because it's a lot of people, of course, visit there, and he starts, oh, this is really great, and somehow it came out, oh, my dad works in preservation, and he's, oh, really? And he says, what are you working on right now? I said, I'm working on some 70-year-old beach cottages in Orange County, California. And he said, that's 5,000 years old. So, of course, it's relative, right? It's relative to what's the history here. So we don't have any 5,000-year-old buildings. We have lots of archaeological sites that are older than that, but we don't have that sort of built life. So it's always going to be relative to that, and I'll talk a little bit about that. And in the U.S., really the first sort of landmark project everybody talks about is when the ladies of Virginia saved Mount Vernon, George and Martha Washington's house. And unfortunately, even though Sears likes to take a lot of credit for the paint, there was a lot more to that before to save that. And that's sort of the first place where we need to capture a building, save it because of its historical significance so that the public can come and visit it. The next sort of known private project comes in the 1920s when Mr. Rockefeller decided to put a lot of money into the community of Williamsburg, Virginia, which was, of course, the colonial capital of Virginia prior to the Revolution. And so they came up with this interesting idea, because there were no professional standards, to say, well, let's just hold it to 1775. And as we learn now today, we cringe, but they therefore tore down a lot of really early 1800s buildings that weren't in the right period. And so at the time, though, but they were able to recreate and then reconstructed things to try to make the place look like 1775. And so those are some of the early private efforts. From a federal and a government agency sort of thing, the very first law that sort of comes into the federal purview to focus on cultural and historical resources is the Antiquities Act of 1906. Now, you may know a little bit that this is the thing that creates national monuments. This is where the president can set aside public land, federal land, and become a national monument. And for us, Cabrillo is our local national monument that's now part of the National Park Service. But those actually, the original focus of that law wasn't to just do big natural areas. It was actually focused on the fact that a lot of archaeological sites in the Southwest were being looted and were not being managed properly. And so this law was set up to set those areas aside to give them some kind of federal protection. And so that was about the only law that really focused on that, because even though the National Park Service was established in 1916, their focus was really more recreation and natural areas. And so it wasn't until 1935 in the Historic Sites Act in which the National Park Service was assigned to be the federal agency to set policy on historical and cultural resources. And that's why now National Park Service is where you go to find all the bulletins and the registers and all the professional training and standards on how we do historic preservation. They are the leader for that nationally, and us in the state, we follow them and all that. And they created the first policies. They also created the Historic American Building Survey and the American Historical Engineering Record, which are the two little acronyms there, as we go out and record historical buildings to make sure that we had them accurately recorded. Now here in California, the focus really comes, and it's interesting, of course, California before the gold rush was just maybe 4,000 to 5,000 non-Native American people living in this this previously pretty remote Mexican territory. The gold rush suddenly brings 100 and 150,000 folks from the eastern U.S. and across the world suddenly were going. And so when preservation begins to be sort of brought up in the 1880s and 90s about what are the things that are historic, the first thing they look to are things like gold rush monuments and Spanish missions. And so, interesting enough, from some of the first organizations, the Native Sons of the West and the Native Sons of California, their focus was to preserve things like the missions and in case of the Marshall Gold Monument, which was now actually part of a state park, for set aside. And you can see some of those. The Pico Mansion in Whittier is the first one in Southern California. It's now a state park. It was actually my very first major restoration project for state parks about 20 years ago. And then there's Sutter's Fort. And then here in San Diego, some some of you may know of the Casa de Cedillo, which is now what is Old Town San Diego State Historic Park, which underwent a very interesting restoration in 1910, in which a woman architect who was assigned, it was purchased by the Spreckels Company, who owned the streetcar line, and they wanted to create an attraction. So they hired this gal who had been an assistant architect at a local firm to take on the project. And so she, not having any standards or professional things to follow on, just decided the best way was to go find Mexican artisans to rebuild it. It had fallen in disrepair. So she went and found Mexican masons and had them recreate it all, but sort of prettied it up and made it look a little rustic and all that, because there were no standards. But it was a very important and probably the first major project here in San Diego County of historic preservation occurring. And then now it's part of the State Historic Park in Old Town. For state parks, we were established officially in 1928. There were state park properties before that, but it wasn't a department until 1928. And our mission is similar to national parks in that we preserve natural cultural resources. And during the 30s, when the CCC was in force, the New Deal program of President Roosevelt, we took advantage of the fact that they would put a lot of camps in our new parks to build things up. If you've ever been to Cuyamaca or Palomar, you will see that park rustic architecture. If you've ever been to Anza Borrego, we have some of it there too. And one of the major projects they took was this thing up in Santa Barbara County, in North Santa Barbara County near Lompoc, where the Mission La Purísima was. And originally it was just a ruin of one building. All the other buildings had been deteriorated at that point. And the original plan was, like the ruins of Southwest, they would just stabilize it, put a nice little picnic area. But they then, after watching what had happened in Williamsburg, they decided to bring in some of the top California historians and archaeologists into the planning team and came up with the idea that since we have all these strong-armed and strong-backed young men, why don't we recreate the whole thing? Why don't we reconstruct the whole thing? So they went out and researched it. They did the archaeology and sort of put the professional side in historic preservation. And today, we look at it. Now, they did things that we wouldn't allow today, like they went to other missions to get details that never existed there, to copy them because, well, it was a mission. That's close enough. And so, in a way, it's sort of it's really a 1930s interpretation of the colonial period. But it's historic in its own right because it's such an important case. And it's actually the very first project National Park Service really went to that level, because they oversaw all our camps. We didn't have staff for state parks for that. So they oversaw all that. They brought the architects in and all that. So this was a very sort of, so in many ways, California has some very cutting edge national historic preservation aspects to it. And today, if you've ever gone to La Purísima, it's great. It's in an area that's sort of away from town, and you can really feel like you step back in time with the 11 reconstructed buildings that we have there. Other efforts in California included things like private things like the Chamber of Commerce in LA deciding to sort of prettify Olvera Street and turn it into a tourist attraction and play on its fact that they were going to preserve it to the old part of Mexican LA. In the 1930s, the state also created the first landmark survey where they went out, and you've seen these plaques all over the state. The first 770, there really weren't any criteria, and so we have some very interesting plaques. A few of them are in our state parks. If you go to the Gold Rush area, you'll see a plaque that says Gold Rush Building. This is a building from the Gold Rush, big brass plaque. My favorite one is one we had in Anza Borrego, and it's called the First White Child plaque. And my favorite story of this is how things change and why you need to keep doing research. That plaque was to commemorate on the Anza expedition when the first baby of the immigrants was born. And of course, in 1950, they wanted to talk about, see, this is the first white folks coming up from Mexico. And of course, later a historian did some research and said, except for the mother, is listed in all the records as a mulatto person. So we always like to say, what? Always an interesting interpretation of these things, and you never know. But they put it in brass, so it's sitting right there in our park for you to see. So the landmark. So, and then since that time, there actually is a process to they get reviewed. The scholarship is now. So everyone after that, and there's about 1,400 of them now or something like that, those ones had to be researched and properly identified and checked for facts and all that. But so you saw these sort of things. So in many ways it was sort of avocationalists as well as professionals sort of working up into the business. And Columbia State and State Parks, because of our success at La Purísima, became sort of the purveyors, especially of reconstruction. And our first big project was Columbia State Historic Park up in the Mother Lode, where we had about 10 original buildings. We've reconstructed a few more. And then here at Old Town San Diego, which was created by a fellow legislator named James Mills, who we will talk about in a minute, created the thing called the Mills Act we were going to talk about, who had started his career as a historian and then became a politician. I'm hoping not to follow any of those paths. And he was able to get that park created. And the plan there is there's 7 original buildings to the period, of which we were going to then reconstruct 57 more. We haven't quite got there yet, but if you've ever been to Old Town, we got about a dozen more in there. But anyway, very interesting sort of focus on that park. So the first real, significant legislation to address this, federal legislation, comes in 1966 with the National Historic Preservation Act. Now, this is the act that actually created officially the is set to preserve sites, but it's also created the National Register of Historic Places, the elite version of those, which are called the National Historic Landmarks, which are those that have national and international significance only. Created our state historic preservation offices, because every state has one of those, funded by the federal government. And then the review group, which is the advisory council, which reviews those nominations. And this set the standards to what makes something actually a historical property and how does it fit into that. And it was done to protect any federally funded or Nexus project permitted projects, and that's where so if you ever hear anybody talking about that, then the review process for that is a thing called Section 106, which is part of that act that tells how projects get reviewed to make sure they aren't affecting any properties that are in fact historically eligible or listed. And this sort of then gives rise to the profession that I've been doing for 30 years and really got started in the late 60s, and that's called cultural resource management. This is where historians and archaeologists and architectural historians practice outside the academic realm, and to do this in the age of planning and historic property management, et cetera, for agencies and such. And there are basically 4 tasks that come out of this, and that's survey and inventory. Do we have historic properties out there? Where are they? Identify them, map them in, evaluate them. Do they meet the criterion that makes them actually eligible to be historic resources that qualify per these laws and these standards to be that? And if so, then nominating them through a process to which they are then vetted. Those reports are created. Someone is reviewing them and determines they in fact meet the criteria and listing them on, in this case, a national register or California or a local register. And then once that happens, you got to take care of them and manage them. Stephen gets to do now. Owns one, right? How do we take care of them? What are the standards for taking care and managing these? A lot of part of the mythology is this thing is that we treat these buildings like they're artifacts, and you got to put kid gloves on to open the doors and everything. That's not realistic in preservation, because you actually have to maintain things, and to maintain things, you often have to take them apart and put them back together. One of my projects right now is the Crystal Cove Cottages in Orange County. I've done 2/3 that. We're in the last third of the project, and literally part of the last phase, we have 17 cottages. I have gone to recording and dismantling 3 of the buildings completely and 3 others partially, because the only way to protect them and put the infrastructure is to take them apart, put all that in, and then put them back together. So this assumption that we all run around with kid gloves and toothbrushes, which we do on occasion in archaeology, and that we're running around, isn't real when it comes to historic preservation. You often have to take things apart and put them back together, and that takes a lot of dedication and focus, and sometimes a lot of money. So anyway, this comes to it. So what is in fact a historic property? This has an official meaning. It doesn't just mean it's old. This really means that it meets the eligibility. And so the definition here is that it could be a building, structure, object. Then it has to be significant in one of these topics of history, architecture, engineering, archaeology, or some kind of cultural value that brings it and is proven through research and scholarship to do that. And historic properties can be anything from buildings, which most people recognize, but they can also be structures, things that aren't built for habitation, like bridges or roads or other things that they're built for use but aren't necessarily for habitation. They can be objects like statuary or folk art pieces, anything that you can show the significance of. And sometimes they're lumped into districts where isn't the individual properties maybe as significant, but as a grouping, they have significance that makes them, and you set a boundary, and that's a district. They can also be cultural landscapes, which is actually what my thesis topic was about, which is looking at all the things, not just the buildings and structures, but also the landscape and things like topography, circulation features, water features, and a spatial arrangement and geographic arrangement that goes to set that property aside. And now there's also our Native American people who come from a different cultural background also have some laws that protect what they call tribal resources. So these resources are them culturally significant to them, but they may not be of a physical building or site. They may just be an area, but it has a cultural significance. And for us in the state agencies, then we work with them to try to make sure whatever projects we're working on addresses any concerns they have about how we manage that property. So what are the actual criteria? There are 3 basic eligibility criteria, no matter, and we'll talk a little bit about the difference between, the national and the state and the local criteria, but they really come down to these 4. There's 4 criteria, 3 criteria of which there's a few details. Now, this is the one that gets thrown out all the time. It's 50 years old, it's automatically historic. That's not true. This is the first sort of cutting edge. And the story, and it might be a little apocryphal, that has been told to me by one of my friends who was the former State Historic Preservation Officer, Wayne Donaldson, that he talked to one of the people who had written the act in '66, and they were trying to figure, well, what's a test of time for a historic property in the U.S.? And in 1966, they said, well, what happened, 50, 75, 100 years ago? And they said, well, 50 years ago, we hadn't even gotten to World War I. Oh, 50 years, yeah, that sounds good. 1960, 50 years, that's it. And they wrote in 50 years. Whether that was as simple as that, I think a little bit thinking by that, but it was how do you set some kind of test of time that something's been around long enough to have gained, and you can put a scholarly look at it and say there's some significance there. This is only a guideline in that there are ways to put properties who are less than 50 years old on to registers, but they have to have extraordinary significance. The only one I've ever done was actually a Cold War era property. That I did when it was about 44 years old, but it was so significant. It was one of the first resource projects that the military signed up with Caltech to bring in the scientists on to do military ballistics testing that led into some of the first major Cold War funding of bringing in scientists to work with the military and set up a lot of the military-industrial complex. That's the only one that I've ever done that's under 50 years old. But 50 years old is generally it. But it's probably the least important of the criteria to make something an eligible resource. But it's sort of that first test of time. This is really where the crux starts to come in, is under significance. You have to be able to prove historical significance within a context, and they're generally lumped into these 4 themes. And like I said, in some cases, the city actually has 8, but if you looked at it, it's sort of a couple of these have been split in half, and that's why there's more. But basically, the first is it has to be some kind of significance in history or events. We call it events. So it has to have some kind of theme or history, whether it's the CCC movement or the growth of suburban development of this kind of type of communities or something. It has to be something that's historical in that nature. And a lot of times, the second is it's associated with a significant person. And it's got to be more than somebody slept here, right? It needs to be associated with their life or their significance. And so I always get the George Washington slept here thing. No, that's not enough usually to get on the National Register. It needs to be he lived there, he worked there, he did something significant there, if you're going to use that criteria. And then the third one is the one that most properties probably get attached to. It's usually most properties are A and C. And C is that it has some design significance. So it's some kind of great piece of architecture, whether that's designed or vernacular, or some piece of landscape architecture, or art value. So those are the kinds of the thing. And D is actually information, which is not for any of those things. That's for archaeology. And that's one little myth of that archaeology. Everybody assumes archaeology is about artifacts. It's not about artifacts. It's about the information artifacts give archaeologists. And so in California especially, I've done a fair amount. Most of the time what we're covering in archaeological sites is refuse and trash, whether that be a prehistoric or a historic site. But we get a lot of information out, and there's enough information to fill a research design, then you get an archaeological site that could be eligible for a register. What we're focusing on here, though, is the built environment. In the case of La Mesa, we don't really have too many archaeological sites since the city's pretty well built out. There's not too many archaeological sites, but it's really more in the built land. So that's that. So you got to have age, but you also have a historical significance. And then the last thing you have to have is called integrity. Now, integrity is not condition. Integrity is the physical ability of that property to convey that significance. So in other words, say you have a building that is significant because, I'll just say, somebody like Bill Walton grew up in it here in La Mesa. I'll use a La Mesa example, right? If the building's been remodeled 4 times, it doesn't look like anything when he lived there, it's not going to have historical integrity, right? So it can't just be that something happened there. If it's been completely remodeled, demolished, replaced, it's not going to be eligible for that thing. And at the same time, I've had many properties that were in poor condition, but all the original stuff was still there. Using the standards, which I'll talk about a little later, you could restore them and keep or retain or even bring back integrity as long as you have enough of the original material or the documentation to bring it back and restore it to that period, appearance, and condition. So it's sort of there's 7 criteria of integrity: location, design, settings, and the key is that it adds up to enough that reflect the period of the significance of that property. So it's age, it's historical architectural significance generally, and then it has to have the physical integrity to reflect that significance, okay? That's the criteria. So it's not, I've had this a lot of time, oh, well, my house is 50 years old, can I put it on the register? Well, you got to go through this process of figuring out if it's eligible. It's not just age. Okay? And if you want to learn more about this in grander detail, the National Park Service websites, the National Register website, there's bulletins, there's all kinds of things. The same with the California State Office of Historic Preservation. A lot of information to learn about how that works for National Register properties and generally overall on that. Here in California, and of course between the National Preservation Act in 1969, they also created the National Environmental Protection Act, NEPA, you may have heard of, which was to look at all actions, not just things that dealt with historic properties. And in California, we followed our own version of that, which is known as the California Environmental Quality Act. It's signed in 1970 by, at the time, Governor Reagan. And just so you know, NEPA was signed by President Nixon. So I just run that out there. Everyone always asks me that, and I say, you know, what's the president who signed more environmental legislation? It's actually Nixon. We won't talk about other issues after that. But anyway, so he actually was very good about that. He actually created a lot of state parks here in California as well. But anyway, he's a native boy. And what this law here in California says that public agencies need to consider the environmental implications of any of their actions that they have control over, and make sure that you're avoiding any significant or adverse effects to the environment. The other part of all these laws is that important piece of public input. A lot of times people assume that somehow these laws were put in to stop development or to stop. They really were to provide public input into projects. And this really comes from not only the concern with things like hazardous materials that come from Rachel Carson's book on the Silent Spring and the poisoning and the pollution. That was certainly part of it. It was the fact that one of the major efforts of bringing these laws was the fact that agencies like rail highway agencies and others were going in and wiping out neighborhoods with no input from those neighborhoods. And so if you'll notice in any of these laws, there's always got to be some kind of public hearing, public input as part of the process, whether it's CEQA, NEPA, or any other process here in the city is the same thing. And that's really a key part of this process, right? And of course, failure to meet those requirements could come in legal challenges, and that's generally how projects can be challenged. But that's sort of, so that, and within CEQA is provisions for historical resources. And that would be defined in our law as any properties listed eligible or even deemed potentially be eligible to be listed, okay, on the National or California Register. And this actually, when I started in the business, we were an appendix. Cultural resources wasn't even fully in, but since that time it has been fully written into the code of CEQA. And I give you the citation in case you're a lawyer or something. You have that now. And that means, and it's very clear that an effect to a historical property is in fact a substantial adverse change to the environment. Therefore, it is just the same as if it was an effect to an endangered species or a traffic issue or whatever condition under the CEQA law. In doing so, then they created their own register. So the state also has its own register, and it's then also used then as sort of criterion for local agencies and state agencies. And it goes those that are the historic landmarks. We talked about those plaque properties, right? As well as some of lesser integrity, which there's some conditions in the California Register. So things that maybe don't have great integrity, but are still significant. In the case of us at State Parks, the Malibu Pier, which is one of my restoration projects, had been remodeled enough that it wouldn't be fully eligible for that, but we were able to get it on as a point of historical interest and then still follow the standards to preserve it. And so that's the thing, as well as any property that's on a local register technically is on the California Register. Right? And those are all approved by our State Historical Resources Commission. All right, so let's get to the local stuff, right? Let's talk about La Mesa. So La Mesa actually this is all part of our general plan. There's a historic preservation element, and our most recent general plan goes to 2012. And there's the whole chapters in there, and there's your assignment. And we, of course, we have a landmark registration, and we have all the different pieces to which they go. And it's interesting enough because this is actually, we were pretty cutting edge. This goes back to the 1980s, as I mentioned before. And the steps are very similar here. What we do for our local register as we would do for the National Register, just that you would go through the State Office of Historic Preservation. You would prepare a nomination report. It gets sent in. If you can justify your eligibility, it's then submitted to the planning staff. And wave, Allyson. There's Allyson. She gets to help with that, right? And it gets reviewed and maybe goes back and forth a few times. And then if it's ready, it goes to the Preservation Commission for its review. If they concur, then it would be submitted to City Council for their approval. If they approve it, then it actually is listed on the city's register, historical landmark register. And that allows you to have the option of perhaps applying for the Mills Act property tax credit, which I'll talk about in a little bit. And then the goal is you're sort of creating a contract then with the city for that to preserve generally the facade of the building, and then for that you'll get your to the standards of preservation standards, and then you'll get your tax break that goes with that. And as the criteria, I mentioned the criteria, we actually have 8 criteria in the city, but it's sort of the 4 split into little pieces in some spots. But it's basically the same thing: history, persons, a style and construction methodology. There's also a separate listing if it's an acclaimed builder, designer, architect, if it's a person or a group or an institution, if it has a specific artistic craftsmanship, and if it's an arc site, or if it's a district, which is identified as geographically definable area. And we'll talk about that in a minute. And so there's an example. There's some reports there, just to give you an example. And so people do these. They often do, sometimes they do them themselves. Sometimes they hire a consultant. Some folks with the same credentials as me, or others, or sometimes they do a little both. Sometimes they do their own research and then hand it to a consultant to put together, or ask other people to help them, and then they nominate those reports. The reports include, as I mentioned, some property information. What can you document about the history of the property, who owned it, any changes that were made to it, what kind of historical significance might it have to the locals, either architecturally or in the history of La Mesa. These people were involved. They were significant people. They were mayors or business owners or whatever it is. And then you will put in information, and you put all that documentation together, including your bibliographies and all the descriptions of the building, as well as things like photographs, current photographs, historic photographs, if you can find them, historic ads or information, building permits, and plans or drawings or whatever else you might be able to put together to document the significance and make your case that the property is historically significant and has integrity. For example, and we have currently 48 properties here in the city alone that are listed on our register. There's about a quarter of them right there. And of course, they range in a variety of styles and ages. And as you may recognize some, the Historical Society's McKinney House was the first one to make it onto our register here in the city back a ways in the 80s. Our oldest property that's on the register is the 1891 Albert Gray House over here on Cullowhee. And our newest property is actually just one that was put on last November, the Adams Residential Complex, a mid-century modern by local designer John Mortensen over on Adams Avenue that has buildings built between 55 and 59. The city owns two historic landmarked properties, the Collier Park Spring House and the Porter Hall, which was actually our first official library and then was moved across the street. So even in that case, it was moved across the street, but the job was done to keep the integrity. It's still eligible. And styles represented on our register are all those there. Folk Victorian, we have Craftsman's, we have Tudor, Prairie, Spanish Colonial, and now Mediterranean Revival, mid-century modern. So we have quite a variety of architectural background here in La Mesa. And represents some fairly significant, both local and regionally significant architects. Lloyd Rocco, who actually grew up in this area, did many of his early houses here. Lillian Rice, one of the first female practicing licensed architects here in Southern California, was very well known for her work in Rancho Santa Fe. Alberto Treganzo, a Lemon Grove boy. Cliff May did a few houses in this area before he moved off to LA. Sam Hamill, who was a local boy who also did many of our schools and many prominent buildings in San Diego, including was part of the group that did the county building downtown, as well as the Veterans Building in Balboa Park, for example. Did many of our schools and other buildings around here. And C.J. Paderewski, who was one of the known, also a really well-known modernist architect here, known as Mr. San Diego to the architects. So we have a lot of history and heritage that's going on here that a lot of people don't know about, but is really some really wonderful legacy. We do have one historic district just over here down the street from us, the Dade Avenue Historic District, which was identified in the original survey. And there, even if a building's not a contributor, because they're within the historic district, if you pull a permit, you'd have to get your project reviewed to get a certificate of appropriateness. Doesn't mean you have to list your property, doesn't mean that, but you're within that historic district, sort of a planning zone thing. So, how did this all sort of come about? Well, we were actually very cutting edge. In 1982 and 83, the city contracted with the University of San Diego, who was trying to create a sort of a public history program, and to bring in a bunch of students to do a resources inventory. And the procedures are all codified in our ordinances here, and still there in the general plan. And so they went out and tried to find buildings. Now, back in 1983, thinking 50 years back, they basically looked at buildings that were built before World War II. So basically, any building built before 1941 was potentially one they would look at to possibly put on our inventory. Because the way the ordinance reads, if a property is on the inventory, then it has to be reviewed as a potential historic resource. This is how we show our compliance with CEQA and some of these in our ordinance at all. And so in many ways, this was sort of cutting edge. We were one of the first cities actually to do this in the county. We identified about 350 properties that were recorded, put onto recordation forms. Those are the standard forms you see that the Office of Historical Preservation uses. And we have this 2-volume that was certified in 1984. Unfortunately, we haven't really added too many properties to it. The assumption was we would continuously update them. A few properties were added in the years, but right now, because of the backlog and the way La Mesa built out, the reality is that the majority of our properties out there today are now over 50 years old, but haven't been assessed for the inventory. So this has created a loophole in our review process, the way the ordinance is written, that if it isn't on the inventory, they don't have to review it for the city's list. They still would possibly have to do it for CEQA, but not for the city's list. And many of our properties probably would only be eligible for the city list and not the National or California Register. And probably the most recent one that sort of jumped out to everybody was the Drew Ford Roundhouse, which, because a permit was pulled to demo it before it was 50 years old, it didn't get that full review. Now, in the end, we ended up getting some of the mitigation measures we probably would have got if they had decided to move forward anyway, such as recording the building and those kinds of things. But it didn't allow, once again, the public to have input and us to try to make the case to the owners that maybe there's some value there for them. So that's sort of where we're trying to help the cite out with that, because obviously we have a huge backlog of properties that need to be looked at to see if they need to be on the inventory or not. And here's the language, and you can cite it if you like, but it says unless it's included in the inventory, it doesn't get that review. So we want to help the city sort of catch up on that. And so this is why we're trying to get this historic resource inventory rolling. We're doing this, and the benefits of getting that inventory is, one, of course, compliance with both that CEQA as well as our own ordinance. Also identifying what are eligible, but also non-eligible properties, because right now any property that's over 50 years old, theoretically, the city may have to ask that property owner to evaluate it. If we can have some of that done at time, that would save them the cost if they don't have a historic property, to be able to, save them time as well as the city staff time, but also make sure we don't miss any of those properties. So certainly will help expedite our project reviews. Would also promote preservation benefits of letting people know about, so you come here today to learn about what are property value benefits, what are Mills Act tax breaks, can we save our property and be more green just by preserving it, as well as for us in the Historical Society, another benefit is just we're going to get out there and do a lot more historical research, knowledge. We're going to talk to people, do oral histories, do research, learn that much more about this community that we can share as our mission at the Historical Society with everybody here in the community. So what is a survey? Well, basically, this is the official sort of focus where you go out and actually strategically go out in an area and try to figure out, are there properties there that could be potentially eligible for the local register? What will come out of that are recordation forms. Like I said, primary historical sources, information, oral histories, and other information about the history of neighborhoods and other bibliographic and historical data that will put it together in a place that we can have it to share with everybody and use for those who want to move forward and nominate their properties. There are two basic levels to a survey that's done professionally. It's called reconnaissance, sometimes called a windshield survey, which is the idea of you sort of doing a cursory look. You're coming in, maybe a quick photograph, a little bit of background research. Does this thing have any chance of being eligible? Move it to the next step of research. So that's called reconnaissance survey. The intensive survey is where you actually go through and try to determine, do you have an eligible property? You'll do all that research I was mentioning to you on that specific property that sort of passes the first test. Wow, it's a very nice architectural building, or we found out an important person in the history of the Mesa owned it. Let's go figure out what, if they have any significance, it still has integrity. That kind of level is where you actually fill out those and try to make an initial determination if you think you might have a historic property or not. And right now, we are working at this sort of first level, and we were able to, our partnership at the Historical Society with San Diego State, my alma mater, but we also have a couple new professors in the Archaeology and History Department who are bringing in grad students, and we were actually able this last spring to use some grad students who are interested in public history to beta test our recordation app. So as opposed to the way I used to do this, and these guys did it, was with a clipboard and a bunch of blank forms, and you filled them out, and then you went back to the office and typed them all up. We've got it now, and the city has this version too, where we can actually have them use a phone or a tablet to actually do the same thing on site, take the picture, loads right into the form, all the data goes right into the form. So we're really looking at a way to hopefully take some advantage of this technology to expedite the survey process. And then from there, we're also going to use those grad students and other volunteers to help us gather those historical data and those references and be able to also put them into this database that the city is holding so that they have the information as well as us to make sure that we're building that database so we can help make those calls either direction. And that'll end up in completed forms and further research, or if somebody wants to move forward to evaluation, they have that information to go forward and nominate their properties. So we're going to be doing that field survey, and we're looking to sort of codify this with our grad student partners, as well as at the university, as well as we have some volunteers in the society that are going to help us go out there, and we're going to train how to do that, and we're going to get out there and try to get that initial recordation going here in the next few months, as well as properties we know that need to be put on just because we already know their significance, get those forms completed and get them in so that the Historic Preservation Commission can recommend them to the council to be added to our inventory. All right, so those are some of the steps of that. And you are part of what we're trying to get out there, to let people know this is happening. Do not fear if someone comes by and takes a picture of your house. It's technically not illegal. Otherwise, Google will be in big trouble. And that's just the first step of us trying to figure out, do we have the potential for historic properties out there? And this came up last time because some of you may actually don't live in the city, might be out in the county area. The county has a similar program. And in fact, Stevens property is actually a listed property on the county's register, not the cities that are right outside of town. And so they have the same thing, criteria, it's all the same thing, and there's references there. You talk to their planning department, and they have their own historic sites board and the whole thing. Interestingly enough, as the Historical Society, we sort of cover what we call the greater La Mesa area. So we don't just cover the city boundaries, we also cover Grossmont, Mount Helix, the part of Spring Valley and Rancho San Diego, all those kind of areas that sort of hang in the greater La Mesa area. Interesting enough, the county's register has somewhere around, I think it's like 130 or so properties. 43 of them are in the Helix Grossmont area. So over a third of the historic properties that are county registered are in our neighboring neighborhoods. So a lot of really impressive architectural and historical properties out there, just in our neighbors to the east. All right, so that's the reality. So I was showing you that this is how it really takes. It's not simply someone comes along and just says, hey, you got an old house, you can get your tax break. It's not that simple. Not that don't you wish? It's not that simple, right? It takes more than that. You actually have to show historical significance and integrity of that property to make it eligible, and you have to put the scholarship in there to show that it is. And so the mythology of some of this that comes out whenever this comes up, and here's a couple of them. And the first one is if we put it on the inventory, it automatically lists it. That is not true. You have to nominate a property to put it on the register. The inventory only says it has the potential to be. It does not say you have to. No one can force you to. And part of that myth is that no one, not the city, not the Historical Society, no one can force you to list a property on a register. A private property cannot be forced on the register. Publicly owned ones, we can't turn them down in state parks or something or another agency. If it's eligible, we have to recognize it and deal with it. But for private property, it is not true. No one can list your property without your approval. It's different if you buy one that's already listed, then you need to deal with it. But if it's not listed, it's just potentially eligible, or it could be. No one can force you to put your property on there. The other, of course, that all 50-year-old buildings automatically are historic resources and go on the inventory. That is also not true. The process will define which properties have the potential to be eligible. We'll also define if there's those that aren't, like they've been completely remodeled or already demolished from their original dates. Those ones are going to be taken and put in the file that they're not going to be eligible properties. All right, so those are a couple of the things. The other one, of course, is that once you list your property, you can't even, you can't upgrade it, you can't change anything at all. You can't change the toilet paper roll, you can't do anything, it's historic. That, as you will hear, is not the case at all. And we'll talk about what is the case of what you're transferring. If you do have a property and you go to a Mills Act contract, there are some restrictions because you're trying to trade preserving that resource for the community to get your tax break. But it is not everything at all, okay? So I try to get through the myths pretty quick, and if you have questions, we can ask and debunk anything else we need to. All right, so now you got a historic property. How do you figure out how to properly manage it? And so the measure of effect really is how do you avoid having an adverse impact or substantial change? Well, you use these things the National Park Service created called the Secretary of Interior Standards for the Treatment of Historic Properties. And it's they actually just republished it a couple years ago. It's got a new cover finally. It's about 250 pages. And what it is a bunch of guidelines that was put together not just by architects, but by maintenance people and contractors and historians to try to come up with how do you deal with these things. And there's listings for windows and doors and masonry and how do you treat these things so you don't damage them. And it's really a guideline to help you sort of get there in the practical world of how do you take care of a building that you still want to use, you still want to live in. And I will tell you the easiest way to get rid of a historic building is to board it up and leave it alone. It will next thing you know, you come back 6 months later and you realize there's a leak in the roof and it's gone, it's destroyed, right? So the thing we try in preservation is to make sure people are using them. And there's actually some standards we'll talk about that allow you to use them maybe differently than they were historically, but allows people to keep taking care of them. There's also treatments for cultural landscape features, like everything from vegetation and all that, which is as a cultural landscape person, everybody says, how do you deal with that? Plants die. You're right, plants die. And they often die when you don't want them to. And so there's place to replicate those things as best you can to keep the character. And sometimes you can't always get exactly what used to be. So there's ways to say, well, what's the character of that feature? Can you replace it close enough? Right? And so these are really the professional guidelines for doing the right thing. And these are, like I said, all online on the National Park Service website if you're interested. And there are basically 4 treatments that go into historic property. The first is preservation. So this is the one where you actually have a pretty much intact building, and you're just trying to make sure you can maintain all those features and elements to keep that significance and integrity intact. And that's known as preservation. And there's a whole set of those criteria and how you deal with that. There's a thing called restoration. Now, restoration is when you have a property that maybe has had some additions to it that aren't contributors, or how do you deal to bring it back to its period of significance? How do you properly take off an addition that isn't a contributor? How do you properly bring back things that have maybe been changed, but you now have documentation to put them back? And what are the standards of how to do that? That's restoration as a treatment. Rehabilitation is the one that's probably the most liberal in its sort of opening. And this is the one that was created to adapt what we call adapting. It's often called adaptive use. And the idea is, how do you protect a building that maybe, and this happens a lot in commercial buildings, you'll see this in downtown, where maybe it was a big warehouse, but it's this gorgeous building. The standards for rehabilitation give you a lot of latitude to completely reconfigure the inside to make sure somebody's using it and taking care of it by still protecting, you know, the rest of it that makes it eligible. So these are often used, a lot of architects use it, they're a little more liberal in the ability to change things and tweak things a little bit. But the idea that you're still protecting enough to keep the integrity for an eligible property, but by giving it a new use, you're going to extend its life. You're going to make sure someone's going to take care of it and keep it going. That's rehabilitation standards. And the last one, as I mentioned, state parks, we were quite the kings of this for a while, reconstruction. And this is where you have historical or archaeological or other documentation to which you're going to replicate a building. The challenge with this, and it actually has become a lot less popular in preservation over the last 20 years, is that what you're really still doing is new construction. So even on in the situation of an Old Town San Diego Historic District, all the reconstructions are not contributors to the district. They're called compatible properties to the district. So they don't really have the integrity to be it, but they sort of add to the overall landscape of that district, but they're not actual contributors because they're new buildings. And even though you always want to have more information, you rarely have all the information you want to properly, fully record them. And so this has become a little less popular, but that's what, if you ever say, oh, we're going to reconstruct it, that's sort of a different thing. And it actually doesn't create an official historic building, it creates a compatible building. So I'm going to wheel those 250 pages down to this slide for you, okay? And the first one is good documentation is essential. In other words, and we actually had this come up at the commission meeting the other day, was, well, but I like those kind of Victorian windows. Do you have any documentation that they were on that building? Well, no. Then that would be an adverse effect to change it and put something on it that wasn't there. That's false history. So it's really important to have as good primary documentation you can have to restore and fix up a building. The other step is, of course, you're always going to start at the second bullet. You want to try to remain and protect all that historic fabric you can before you replace it. But there's a practical side to it. That wood has just gone too far. And yes, you could spend $4,000 or $5,000 on consolidants and save it. But there has to be a practical approach. And so if it gets to the point where that is completely infeasible or you can't get that kind of wood anymore, or whatever the detail is, or they don't make that really cool 1960s piece anymore because it was plastic and nobody makes it anymore, or whatever it is, and you can't get it replicated, the next step is when you replace what's called in like kind. So this is where it's okay. In the case of my cottages at Crystal Cove, which are little vernacular beach cottages on the coast, in some of those cottages we're replacing 30-40% of the wood because it's simply too far gone. But we're replacing it with the right kind of wood that matches the character of that. So if it's a case of it's a painted piece of wood, it doesn't really matter what the kind of wood it is. But if it's a piece of wood that has, specific grain lines or a specific type of wood, then you would want to meet and match that because that's the character. And what that second little piece is, that when you do have to replace something, as long as you replace it in like kind, you're okay with the standards and it's an appropriate treatment. The third, then they're about avoiding false historicity. This has come up a lot of this, but I really like this style and I want to add these things from that period. That's really not allowed because that's creating something that's false, that you have no documentation ever existed. So it's not historic, it's brand new. And that's sort of that would affect your integrity. And that's why we always try to avoid those kinds of things. It's a challenge because what the standards say is if you don't really know, so you don't have the documentation, try to replace it with something that has a compatible feel but doesn't mimic anything historically in the building. I know, just hanging there. Architects and construction always scratch the what? Try to make it so it doesn't stand out and everybody goes, oh, look at that big, oh, that's not the historic thing. That's just a rep to fill in the hole, right? So those kinds of things. And of course, the idea of if you do have to make changes to adapt it, is it possible to make those changes reversible? And this is why a lot of times you'll see we get some latitudes to maybe put an accessible ramp on the side instead of the front of the building, or those kinds of things when it's a historic building that allow it, but you can always take it off and those kinds of things and not affect things. So that's just one sort of example of that for the standards. All right, so I'm going to try to zip through this real quick for you because I think we're already running up here. What are the benefits, right? So let me just talk real quick, and I'm going to thank you, Nikki, for letting me borrow your slides here. And if you need to throw in anything on this, let me know. But certainly, there's some unique parts of how the value of historic properties. And I will just tell you that, and she's got some factors here in talking about, the policy to allow it, market acceptance, and all those kinds of things. And then the last piece there, I'm talking about the recycling movement. The reality of if you're preserving a building, whether it's eligible or not, and you're not taking all that wood and material and throwing it in a landfill, you're figuring out a way to keep it. Even if your property isn't eligible, you're actually having a green effect on the environment that is a real positive for us when it comes to preservation. So even if you just have an old house, the ability to try to keep it up and keep it going, and you can use the same standards even if you don't have an eligible building to try to replicate, you're actually having an effect on that, on the environment by not just filling landfills full of old building materials, which are often things that don't degrade very well, and paints and things like that. Market value is obviously a key piece of this, but one of the things, and there's many studies out there that show that historic properties do not lose their value, and neighborhoods around those properties and properties next to them also hold that. Now, of course, there's always upzoning issues, but in residential especially, that's rarely an issue, and that the property values always seem to hold, and you won't see that go down. So the money you put into a historic property is generally always comes back, and that's why the tax break is there to help you make sure you're putting your money into the property. Obviously, if you have some association with famous architects, that can affect that historical property value, that brings in a panache, shall we say, and the ability for both a market value, but also when you're arguing for your tax break, the value of your house, etc. So jump right into the big benefit, right? The big benefit is this wonderful little act that our good local friend Jim Mills created back in 1972. Look at that cool. Nikki put that cool spin in there. That's really cool. Anyway, we spend too much time with PowerPoint. Can you tell? So anyway, name for our local friend. I've met Jim. He was a character. You should read his books. Him and Jesse Unruh. It's a fascinating. If you want to know about 60s California and politics, you got to read those books. But state program, and this allows the cities to then give participants in their preservation programs with eligible properties a significant tax break. And so if you have an eligible property and the city has its own program, and Allyson can talk to you about the specifics if you have questions on that, and it is sort of the leading financial benefit that comes to a property owner for, in fact, listing their property and making that contractual agreement. So it's based on the income potential of the property, and so it's not just you assume, well, say if you bought it 40 years ago and your taxes are low, there's some evaluation here that allows some fluctuation. So, and I think it's anywhere from, it can be as high as 70% of your property tax can be pulled back on that, and I think the lowest is 30 is 30. So it's a fairly, and if you've bought recently, that can be a very significant number, as we know now that we have many $1 million houses around here, right? Losing half your property tax every year is a pretty nice incentive. And of course, you make that contract with, in this case, a city, or if it was the county, to meet the standards in any projects you do, and certainly anytime you would pull a permit, it's going to come up that you need to have that reviewed, in this case, by the city's Preservation Commission. Some basics on those contracts. They generally run for 10-year increments and are officially renewed annually. A property owner can always pull out if they want to. I don't know why you want to pay your taxes back, but anyway. And that contract goes with the land, so it's on your title, as is a registration. That's placed right on your title. And of course, you meet the standards, and it gets occasionally will be inspected. All right. So all those little details on that. In the county, as it says here, La Mesa has this program, as does the incorporated county, and like I said, anywhere from 20, well, it says 20, but 20 to 70. Anyway, a pretty good deal if you have that. Okay. So let's see. 1 to 3 years, that's probably safe. It just depends on how long it takes you to nominate, and there's actually a strategy that Allyson can get into on when you should probably put it in to make sure you don't have to wait an extra year to get your Mills Act. You want to make sure it gets in by October so you don't get too late and have to wait another year to apply for the Mills Act, even if you're eligible. September, so it makes the October meeting. There we go. So, and of course, issues about recessions and other details, and Nikki can answer these details for you if we get into that. Right? Okay. Well, you did it. You survived. You in there? Still out there? Good, good. All right. Yes, and with today's drivers, I always love this cartoon. Written test again. It need not be painful. Historic preservation has a lot of benefits. Hopefully, we can talk a little more about making sure you understand that there's some mythology. This, you can't touch your building, you can't change the inside. And in generally, most of these Mills Act contracts are only about protecting the facade. Now, if you use some interior feature that's significant to say this is why it's eligible, then that might be put into the contract. But people ask, can I remodel my kitchen? Can I fix my bathroom? Yes, most of the time this is rarely an issue in the maintenance or operation or would affect your integrity unless you have, a historically significant bathroom that you listed as a contributing reason to your eligibility, which is, I don't think we have any of those at this point. No significant bathrooms, do we? Yeah, we don't have any significant bathrooms yet. Never know, we might find something, but So that's enough. I think that's enough for you guys. You survived that. So thanks for that.